To the public, Elizabeth and Philip represented strength, loyalty, and permanence. Behind closed doors, however, their marriage entered a world where affection competed with hierarchy, identity collided with protocol, and even the most private decisions could become matters of state. Their union survived, but not without hidden costs. Philip was one of the few people who could speak to Elizabeth as a woman, rather than as a royal figure being prepared for history. He could challenge her judgment, question palace customs, and reach the private person hidden beneath the discipline. In those early years, their relationship offered Elizabeth something the monarchy rarely allowed: emotional shelter. With him, she did not always have to measure every word or consider how it might be interpreted by courtiers. For a brief time, their marriage felt like a world of its own, but the palace was never far away. As Elizabeth moved closer to the throne, royal authority began entering decisions that should have belonged only to husband and wife. Their residence, household, children's family name, public duties, and even Philip's place beside her became subjects of negotiation. Each discussion appeared technical, yet beneath the formal language was a deeper struggle. Philip was trying to preserve his identity, while the institution was quietly asking him to surrender it. He had given up titles, traditions, and parts of his former life to stand beside Elizabeth. Still, the greatest sacrifice came after she became sovereign. Her position would always outrank his. In public, he was required to support her without overshadowing her. In private, he had to accept that advisors could influence choices affecting his own family. The man who had once lived through uncertainty now found himself surrounded by rules he could neither command nor escape. Elizabeth understood his frustration, but understanding did not give her freedom. She was caught between devotion to her husband and duty to an institution that treated compromise as danger. Advisors warned her that personal concessions could weaken royal authority. Philip believed those same warnings were slowly taking control of their marriage. Their responses could not have been more different. Philip demanded honesty, movement, and direct answers. Elizabeth relied on patience. She listened, delayed, and waited for anger to pass. Silence became her shield, but to Philip it could feel like rejection. His resistance, meanwhile, placed her under even greater pressure. Love did not remove their resentment. It made every disagreement more painful. They were not strangers fighting over power. They were two people trying to remain close, while an ancient institution stood between them. Some conflicts were never resolved. They disappeared beneath tours, ceremonies, formal dinners, and public smiles. Though constantly surrounded by staff, the couple had almost no truly private space in which to repair what had been damaged. The schedule continued, and unresolved pain was gradually disguised as stability. Elizabeth had discovered a method that would shape the rest of her life: bury the conflict, perform the duty, and trust time to soften what could not be spoken. But as Elizabeth learned to protect her marriage through silence, another private wound was approaching, one involving her closest family: forbidden love, and a decision that would expose how merciless the crown could become. Princess Margaret's forbidden romance was presented as a constitutional problem, but inside the palace it became something far more personal: a test of whether Elizabeth was still a sister beneath the crown. Whatever decision she made, someone she loved would believe she had chosen the monarchy over their happiness. Margaret was more than Elizabeth's younger sister. She was a living reminder of the life Elizabeth might have known if destiny had chosen someone else. Where Elizabeth had learned to control every feeling, Margaret refused to hide hers. She was expressive, restless, and drawn toward the freedom her sister could no longer afford. Their differences did not weaken their bond at first. In many ways, they made it stronger. Margaret could say what Elizabeth had been trained to silence. But forbidden love changed everything. What began as a private attachment soon became a palace crisis. Advisors examined it through religion, tradition, public reputation, and constitutional duty. To Margaret, it was a matter of the heart. To the establishment, it was a threat that could reopen old wounds and make the monarchy appear willing to bend its own rules. Elizabeth was trapped between two worlds. In private conversations, she could offer warmth, patience, and sympathy. Yet she avoided promises, because every promise carried consequences beyond the room. A sister might say, "I will stand beside you." A sovereign had to ask what that support might cost the crown. Margaret may have believed Elizabeth possessed the power to end the struggle. After all, she wore the crown. Ministers listened to her. Courtiers bowed before her. But Elizabeth knew the terrifying limits hidden beneath that authority. Defying the establishment during the vulnerable early years of her reign could create a political storm, divide the church, and weaken public trust. What looked like personal freedom to Margaret looked like institutional danger to those surrounding the throne. That difference became a wound neither sister could easily name. Elizabeth's position made complete honesty almost impossible. Every private sentence risked becoming advice, approval, or royal instruction. Even silence carried meaning. When she hesitated, Margaret could hear rejection. When she spoke carefully, Margaret could hear the cold language of the palace rather than the voice of her sister. The final separation did not simply end a romance. It changed the emotional distance between them. Publicly, they remained united by blood, ceremony, and royal duty. Privately, something had been broken. Formal smiles could hide resentment, but they could not erase it. Elizabeth may have wondered whether she had saved the monarchy or merely allowed it to punish someone she loved. There was no answer that could free her from guilt. The crown remained secure, yet her sister carried the loss, and a brutal precedent had been set. When personal happiness challenged royal order, Elizabeth would be expected to defend the institution, even when the person standing on the other side was family. That precedent would return again and again. But before it reached the next generation, Elizabeth would retreat into a hidden world of locked rooms, inherited objects, and jewels carrying secrets no public ceremony could explain. Behind palace doors lay jewels the public rarely saw, stones inherited through grief, rivalry, scandal, and death. Some were displayed as symbols of continuity, others remained hidden. And according to palace whispers, Elizabeth's reasons for refusing certain pieces had less to do with fashion than with memories she could not escape. Inside the private royal collection, nothing was simply beautiful. Every tiara carried the weight of succession. Every necklace held the memory of a marriage, an alliance, or a loss. Brooches could mark loyalty. Diamonds could confirm rank. Even a single borrowed piece might reveal who had been welcomed closer to the center of royal power, and who remained outside it. Elizabeth understood this silent language better than almost anyone. She knew that choosing jewelry for a public occasion was never just a matter of taste. A stone might honor a country, reassure an ally, remember a relative, or quietly defend a family tradition. One wrong choice could revive an old dispute. One familiar jewel could send a message more powerful than any official statement. That knowledge made certain pieces difficult to wear. Some jewels were allegedly tied to painful relationships, questioned ownership, or moments the palace preferred to leave buried. Their brilliance could not erase the memories attached to them. A necklace might recall a family disagreement. A tiara could carry the shadow of a broken promise. A brooch inherited through grief might remind Elizabeth not only of the person she had lost, but of everything left unsaid before that loss became permanent. Selecting jewelry, therefore, became a private ritual of control. Trusted attendants opened cases, checked inventories, and followed instructions known to only a small circle. Behind those decisions may have been handwritten notes, personal preferences, and warnings about pieces considered too sensitive for certain occasions. The public saw elegance. Elizabeth saw history waiting to be disturbed. She also understood the power of lending. When a royal woman received access to a treasured heirloom, it could suggest trust, acceptance, or temporary elevation. But the privilege could be withdrawn. A jewel returned to its cabinet might quietly signal that a relationship had changed. Elizabeth could communicate approval without praise and distance without confrontation. Yet this power carried a psychological burden. Many of the objects around her did not truly belong to her in an ordinary sense. They belonged to the crown, the royal collection, history, or the future. She guarded them knowing they would eventually pass into other hands. With each transfer, their meaning could change. A piece linked to one loyalty might later represent another. That uncertainty made succession deeply personal. What would happen when the jewels were divided, lent, inherited, or reinterpreted by the next generation? Could private instructions protect their meaning, or would old symbols become weapons in new family struggles? The danger was already approaching. Her children were building lives, marriages, and rival loyalties of their own. Soon, questions of favor and inheritance would no longer remain inside locked cabinets. The jewels could be locked away, but the family's growing fractures could not, and when the marriages of Elizabeth's children began collapsing, the private discipline that had protected her for decades started becoming a prison. Elizabeth had spent her life mastering national crises, yet the most painful battles unfolded inside her own family. As her children's marriages fractured and private resentments became public spectacle, the monarch who could advise governments faced a devastating question. Had the crown prevented her from truly knowing her children? To the nation, Elizabeth often seemed like a steady mother to everyone. She offered reassurance in uncertain times, spoke with calm authority, and represented continuity when the country felt divided. But inside her own family, motherhood was far more complicated. Her children did not experience her only as a parent. They also lived beneath the shadow of her position, surrounded by rules, staff, schedules, and expectations that could never be separated from ordinary family life. Royal tours and state duties took Elizabeth away during years that could not be repeated. The distance was not always chosen, but it still left a mark. She expressed love through protection, routine, practical support, and the preservation of tradition. She made sure the structure held. She believed stability was a form of care. Yet emotional pain did not always respond to structure. Each of her children carried the pressure differently. Some accepted duty as the price of belonging. Others struggled against the narrow path prepared for them. Privilege protected them from many ordinary hardships, but it also placed every mistake under public judgment. As their marriages began to fail, Elizabeth found herself trapped in a familiar conflict. She could comfort them as a mother, or she could respond as sovereign. Rarely could she do both without consequence. Her instinct was to wait. She remained calm, avoided sudden intervention, and trusted that time might cool anger before it became permanent. In political life, that patience had often protected her. Inside a wounded family, it sometimes created deeper resentment. Some relatives saw wisdom in her silence. Others experienced it as emotional absence. A few may have heard quiet disapproval in every word she chose not to say. Behind closed doors, deeply personal suffering was translated into official language. Broken marriages became discussions about schedules, titles, residences, finances, public statements, and security. Pain was organized into documents. Betrayal became a communications problem. Love became a negotiation. That transformation frustrated Elizabeth more than she could publicly admit. Family arguments no longer remained private. They were fought through newspapers, interviews, leaks, and competing accounts of who had been wronged. Every emotional wound became part of the monarchy's reputation. Worst of all, she was watching old patterns return. Loneliness, forbidden love, silence, and institutional pressure had shaped her own youth. Now they were moving through the next generation with even greater force. She had spent decades protecting the crown from private disorder, only to discover that the pressure of protection might be creating the very rebellion she feared. And soon, the family's suffering would collide with a tragedy so overwhelming that patience, protocol, and silence would no longer be enough. Then came the tragedy that shattered every palace strategy, turning private grief into public fury and forcing Elizabeth to confront a nation that suddenly believed its queen had remained silent for too long. When Diana died, Britain did not simply mourn, it demanded an emotional response from the crown. Behind palace walls, Elizabeth faced grieving grandchildren, furious public opinion, hostile headlines, and advisors warning that silence itself had become dangerous. For the first time, her lifelong restraint threatened the institution it was meant to protect. The news shattered the royal family's normal rhythm. Schedules, ceremonies, and carefully arranged duties suddenly meant nothing. At the center of the crisis were William and Harry, two boys forced to face an unbearable loss under the attention of the entire world. Elizabeth's first instinct was not political. It was protective. She wanted to shield them from cameras, crowds, speculation, and the full force of a nation's grief before they had even begun to understand their own. But outside the palace, the public expected something different. People wanted the Queen to return immediately, speak openly, and lead the mourning. They wanted visible sorrow from an institution famous for hiding emotion. Every hour of silence created more anger. Every unchanged royal routine appeared colder. What Elizabeth believed was privacy began to look like distance, and what the palace considered restraint was rapidly being interpreted as indifference. Inside the royal household, advice came from every direction. Some argued that family protection must come first. Others insisted that tradition should guide each decision. A growing number warned that precedent had become dangerous and that the monarchy could not survive if public fury continued to rise. Elizabeth faced a painful contradiction. She had to honor Diana's importance, without pretending the relationship between Diana and the institution had been simple. There had been conflict, hurt, separation, and years of public tension. Now death had changed the emotional balance overnight. The nation remembered Diana as a beloved figure. The palace was being judged not only for its actions after her death, but for every wound that had come before it. The absence of visible royal mourning became a symbol. Newspapers filled the silence with accusation. Crowds gathered. Anger hardened. Even the flag above the palace became part of the battle, transformed from protocol into a test of compassion. Then the decisions began to shift. The flag was lowered. Elizabeth returned to London. Most importantly, she addressed the nation in a way few had expected. It was a moment of surrender to a new reality. The monarchy could no longer rely on emotional distance and assume the public would call it strength. Yet the hardest duty remained standing beside William and Harry while they mourned before millions. Elizabeth had to appear steady, even as the family's pain became part of a national ceremony. The monarchy survived, but the warning was impossible to ignore. Institutional caution had brought the crown dangerously close to lasting damage. Elizabeth understood that silence could protect dignity, but it could also create a void filled by suspicion, resentment, and rage. Elizabeth had survived the most dangerous week of her reign. But survival required change, and the private reforms that followed would soon be tested by scandal, rebellion, and a younger generation unwilling to suffer in silence. In her final decades, Elizabeth appeared calm, almost untouchable. Behind that calm, the monarchy was being pulled apart by scandal, public accusation, broken alliances, and relatives demanding freedom from royal control. The Queen's greatest weapon remained silence. But now even silence could be interpreted as judgment, fear, or surrender. The world around her had changed. Elizabeth belonged to a generation taught to endure privately, speak carefully, and never allow personal pain to threaten public duty. Younger royals were less willing to accept that bargain. They wanted their struggles understood. Some spoke through interviews, statements, friends, or legal action. What earlier generations had buried was now becoming public testimony. That shift transformed every family dispute into something larger. A disagreement was no longer only about hurt feelings or damaged trust. It became a question of media strategy, legal danger, public sympathy, and the monarchy's reputation across the world. One accusation could dominate headlines. One careless response could deepen the crisis. One silence could be treated as proof of guilt. Elizabeth answered with the methods that had protected her for decades. Access was limited. Statements were shortened. Meetings remained private. Decisions were delayed until emotion cooled. Family pain was separated from royal procedure as carefully as possible. But the separation was becoming impossible. Titles, patronages, security arrangements, homes, uniforms, public duties, and ceremonial privileges turned into bargaining tools inside deeply personal conflicts. These decisions looked administrative from the outside, yet each carried an emotional message. To remove a role could feel like rejection. To deny a uniform could reopen an old wound. To restrict access could be seen as punishment rather than protection. Elizabeth may have tried to preserve family bonds behind closed doors, even when official actions appeared cold. Yet it became increasingly difficult to know where her personal wishes ended, and palace advice began. Courtiers, lawyers, senior relatives, and communications teams surrounded every crisis. Some family members believed that if they could only speak to her directly, the outcome might change. But the systems designed to protect the sovereign also controlled who reached her, when they reached her, and what information arrived first. That created suspicion. Was the Queen refusing them? Or was someone speaking in her name? The emotional toll was severe. Elizabeth was expected to defend the monarchy even when the scandal involved someone she loved. She feared that open family warfare could damage more than individual reputations. It could weaken public faith in the future reign and leave the next sovereign carrying conflicts that had never been settled. Everyone wanted her approval, forgiveness, or intervention, yet few approached her without calculation. The higher her authority became, the more isolated she appeared. And as age narrowed her world, she began preparing for what would come after her. The succession, the inheritance, the private gifts, and the final messages that might say what public duty never allowed. As the Queen's world grew quieter and her circle narrowed, one final task remained: deciding what would pass to the next generation, what would remain hidden, and which private truths would follow her beyond the crown. Near the end of her life, the woman behind the crown had outlived advisors, relatives, rivals, and nearly every witness to her earliest sacrifices. The world knew her face, her voice, and her rituals. Yet the deepest question remained unanswered. After 70 years of duty, who truly knew Elizabeth herself? Her final years were shaped by absence. Trusted companions disappeared. Family tensions became harder to contain. Age narrowed the routines that had once carried her across the world. The monarch remained visible, but the private woman behind the role was retreating into a smaller circle of familiar places, trusted faces, and memories that belonged to another life. Then Philip was gone. His death removed more than a husband. It took away one of the last people who remembered Elizabeth before the throne had fully claimed her. He had known the young woman behind the discipline, the wife behind the sovereign, and the private frustrations hidden beneath years of controlled public service. Without him, another doorway to her earlier self quietly closed. Comfort came through familiar routines. Beloved animals, personal photographs, old correspondence, trusted clothes, inherited objects, and residences filled with memories offered a kind of stability no ceremony could provide. These were not symbols for the nation. They belonged to Elizabeth the woman, or at least to what remained of her after decades of duty. But questions lingered about what she recorded in private. Were there journals, letters, sealed instructions, or reflections that revealed emotions absent from her public words? Had she written down regrets she could never speak? Had she explained decisions that wounded those closest to her? The palace might preserve such papers, restrict them, or allow only selected fragments to emerge. Her final decisions carried similar mystery. Jewels, photographs, handwritten notes, personal gifts, and family keepsakes had to be separated from crown property and items belonging to the royal collection. Yet distribution was never merely practical. A gift could signal affection. An heirloom could express trust. A private message could offer reconciliation, or confirm a distance that had never been repaired. Even after death, however, her wishes would not remain untouched. Palace hierarchy, public fascination, and family politics would shape how every decision was interpreted. What Elizabeth intended as love might be read as favor. What she meant as continuity might be viewed as exclusion. That was the tragedy of her two identities. Elizabeth the sovereign would be preserved through ceremony, monuments, archives, and history. Elizabeth the woman would survive only in fragments, remembered differently by those who knew separate pieces of her. Her greatest achievement came at an enormous emotional cost. She protected the monarchy by ensuring that her personal desires never became greater than the crown. Her hidden life was not defined by one shocking secret, but by thousands of feelings restrained, choices surrendered, and private wounds carried without explanation. Perhaps the truest version of Elizabeth remains inside sealed letters, locked cabinets, fading memories, and stories the palace may never release. The crown showed the world a queen who never broke, but behind its gold, ceremony, and silence lived a woman who spent a lifetime breaking quietly. And perhaps her greatest secret was not what she concealed from history, but how much of herself she surrendered to create it.